Welcome again, everyone, to another episode of Disruption Drives. I have a very special guest today, Peter Fallon, the head of strategy at Motional. Peter has a deep background in all things deep tech, and his background includes aerospace, defense, electrical engineering, including a stint at Sensata Technologies. He now, of course, works on significant commercialization initiatives at Motional. Uh, Motional is a joint venture between Aptiv and Hyundai Motor Group. They were incidentally one of the first commercialization deployments of robotaxis in total in Vegas with Lyft, I think back in 2022. So, Peter, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Nice
Peter,
to be here.
I wanted to sort of Motional is, of course, one of the early success, in fact, broadly successful deployment of robotaxis. But Motional then, decided to sort of scale back from, and they one of the criticisms broadly of the industry is that very often there is this overwhelming focus on safety, which I understand why, because that is the big societal promise. But do you think that there's been overwhelming focus on that safety as a feature, which is an intangible benefit in all fairness? And how is this debate playing out at Motional from a design and strategy standpoint?
Sure. I guess to start off, right, there is no industry without safety. That's the mission here. And we always say safety first approach, no matter how we're going at it. And I think the industry has to do that to proliferate. I don't think there's any other way to do it. That being said, I think, in the early days of the industry, things were set up very, one then the other, the traditional robotics, very rules based. And, along came some of the more ML techniques that put you away from it. I think today, you really have to think about specifically safety and ride comfort kind of as one bucket. We really think of perceived safety as well, being a big part and driven by rider comfort. So one, we still have a real safety first approach, and I think the industry needs that. But there's new ML techniques that you really need to start building in the beginning of your system to be able to enable those things to grow together, I'll say. So there's ways around, solving 99% of the cases and not solving the corner cases as much today, whether that's remote vehicle assistance or just, emergency sort of stops that exist in the market today. So I think you've seen some of that proliferate a little bit more into some of these early commercialization efforts by some of the other folks. I think Motional is taking a separate approach. We feel that we've kind of already done that. So we really want to go back to commercialization with the full autonomy system, um, in control all the time, and really, make that as safe as can be, but also really comfortable to the rider to drive that perceived safety.
You mentioned, of course, the concept of perceived safety, which is a
Hmm.
art, educating the customer through PR or just maybe demonstrated safety records and being transparent about your own technology. But
Yep.
you're also making a very strong technological bet, fundamentally, and what even in comparison to the rest of the robotaxi ecosystem. Tell us a bit about Motional's sort of unique technology, because you have this concept and you've published in public about, the large driver model, which is sort of a pun, if you may, on large language models, perhaps.
Sure.
Intent is to reduce, at least published, is the intent is to reduce the testing costs and therefore effort and therefore cost for edge cases.
Hmm.
How does this work? Tell us a bit about this. What is that bet that Motional is making that is central to, its purpose?
Yeah, I'll caveat this with I'm not the deep tech guy at
I get
Motional, but I
You're the
know enough to
strategy
be
guy.
dangerous
You're the
in the
strategy
ML
guy.
space. No, I mean it is Motional has deployed some of this initially, using novel technologies, using, as you said, LLMs or VLMs, the new way of the world and foundation models. We're not using generative AI in our actual production stack. We do use some of that offline. All that being said, really, it's a way, a new way in which to look at the world in real time with data-backed solutions. Internet scale solutions are one thing with Gen AI. We have decades and decades of driving experience with those corner cases that we've built up over the years. We're now now with everything going on in these sort of, in the larger scale models, we're able to go back and really utilize all of that data from all of the corner cases and all of the weird stuff we've seen along the years, whether it's in LA, Singapore, Boston, Pittsburgh, all these places that we've driven, and then feed that back into the latest model and see how it's working. So just the ability to really take all of that data in is it's a huge change, right? Before we used to go sort of piece by piece by piece, as I was saying, because of that lack of, you couldn't even do it, right? You couldn't even ingest this whole piece of data. You couldn't grow the models as big. The cost was too high. The compute didn't even exist. So it's really a shift in how we do things, and how we've built the stack over the last year or so. I'd say 18 months, and it's it really is paying dividends already. You're seeing other industry players shift to this, right? I think there's emerging companies shifting to this as well. I think the difference here is that Motional has that history of experience in driving on the road and building the real physical robotic systems already, that we know the intricacies of what's different with gathering external data and actually looking at real world data, the play between the data engine and the actual on-road system. You can do as much simulation as you want. You're never going to get a one-to-one model. You see different things. So I think that's really at a very high level what we're talking about.
You bring up an interesting point, and maybe I'll sharpen the pencil a little bit on it. But look, there's obviously simulations that, I think most of the companies are doing, and you can obviously build it in a laboratory and be successful or not, and you can fix your. But the real world data that you have, several decades, looks like at least a combination of several decades. What has changed in the last 18 months that have made this actually for you in your mind, again, this LDM model more scalable and therefore looks like more likely to commercialize, especially from your vantage point as the head of strategy?
Yeah, and I'll start with saying I'm not
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not
totally
asking.
writing off simulation either. It is a
Well,
huge
it's
and
a
helpful
mixture. You need to
solution.
marry both. You need to
It's
marry both, right?
exactly.
Right. But
Yeah,
your
exactly.
it looks like your differentiator really is that real world experience for Motional, at least.
Yeah, and being able to solve the corner cases within that world is something that's a little bit different and very unique to even the skill set of folks here. It's a very niche kind of thing. Um, the emerging technologies that everybody's hearing about and every day, the foundation models that they're producing some of these Gen AI models, it's really enabling this whole thing. So these techniques that were purely research, really, right, up until a couple of years ago when things started proliferating this way, building end-to-end solutions has been, a game changer. Tesla's been doing end-to-end since the start. Um, because of that, they also miss on a lot of the corner cases, and I'd like to think that starting first with, smaller, more diverse models has actually made us have that safety case to solve the corner cases, and then you going towards model unification. So we haven't wasted 10 years on this technology. It's all built up to this. But yeah, it's really everything you hear about, and it's just applying it in a different way or in a different application, with some very unique pieces of that, again, we're able to utilize from the
Absolutely.
extremely talented engineers over here too.
Let me pivot from, obviously engineering,
Yeah,
obviously what you're thinking is spending your days thinking about, which is commercialization.
yeah.
Now, transport, we are fundamentally in the world of transport and mobility, and it's a network-driven industry. There is at least some room for thought that look at Uber, for example, and Lyft broadly, that this is a winner-take-all market. Tell me a bit about look, and then that would essentially imply that an early mover has some advantages. Doesn't mean that they are the only. And Uber was not by any means the first you know um, ride-hailing service, but is there a benefit at all to commercializing later? Or do you think that this robotaxi industry, as it stands right now, is emerging to support multiple players, or maybe geography dependent?
Yeah, it's a long question. Let me
Yeah.
try to
Yeah.
address it. Let me try to break it down a little bit. Yeah, so I think being first to market matters. I'm not saying it doesn't. Waymo's out there proving it. They're first to market. They're creating a market in a way. They're, building investor confidence. It's great. We're all going to ride that wave a little bit. What they've done in the last couple of years has been impressive. And, we have a path to get there, certainly. We're not there today, but we really do believe that. And so I won't say riding on the coattails is the wrong way to put it. And we don't think of ourselves as kind of a fast follower, even though we are to a degree. Um, but I think there's a couple ways you could see this playing out, right? We do definitely believe there's room for multiple players in the market, whether that's per city or per country or per, or what we call ODM, the ride hail provider. It's kind of yet to be seen. Um, but that's not a list of 20 companies, right? I think it's a list of 5 to 6 in North America, maybe a few more on top of that in Europe. And then there's China for China and some of the Asian markets. There might be some different unique players, but we'll see how it plays out. And so I think there is a leader advantage in that sense. It's not going to be open to everyone. It's highly capital intensive. When we roll out fleets, that's one thing. But again, on the flip side, you do see Uber, especially, right? Creating a space where they want multiple players, and you'll see multiple players, especially in the first, 5, 6 years, compete to get there. It has to be that way for them. It has to be that way for the ride hail industry yeah, more broadly. Um, and then like, I guess, Waymo is a threat, and yet they're still a partner, right? If you look at it that way, I think Waymo One has been successful in San Francisco, but Waymo is also must see, right, by their strategy that access to the Uber, ride hail fleet as it is, and just the app and everybody has it gives you instant demand, and that's how we think of it as well. Um, I'd also say that within the industry, right, there's ride hail penetration on other pieces of the industry that we've already seen today. I think we expect that to keep going, that momentum. So the SAMs keeps getting bigger in that sense, but we're really still tip of the iceberg with how much penetration Robotaxi has over the human driver.
Right.
So I think for the next 10 years, there's just going to be enough demand to displace human drivers, really. Maybe not 10 years, but close to that,
Fair enough.
to really say, okay, you're not even competing against the other robotaxi companies. You're still competing against a
And
human
let me
driver.
let me sharpen that because you're of
Yeah,
course retail is also a growing industry. Actually, okay, I used to run Zipcar before in a
yeah,
previous life. Uh, they called it car sharing there.
yeah,
Uh, but let me ask you this, bro. Of course, ride hail also growing. Robotaxi is growing within a segment of ride hail as of now,
yep,
and there's at least one famous player who, well, and actually the entire industry that thinks that well, personally owned cars for various different reasons, maybe the actual real market.
yep,
You fall. This may not be emotional question so much, but you're of course Hyundai and I don't even know how to pronounce that, and Aptiv are classical auto industry players and a supplier, and of course OEM. Where does your mind fall on that? Personally owned cars versus the ride hailing, right, monetizing rights, monetizing the car itself or monetizing the rights.
sure.
Where do you fall in that? And even the debates at Motional.
Yeah, I mean, so Motional itself, right? We are pretty laser focused within the robo-taxi space itself, right? But at the same time, we're developing L4 technology that could be broader to the market. With the foundational models even that we're talking about, it could be even broader than L4. It could be like robotics and autonomous robots and other industries even eventually. Um, but the sort of go to market, commercial, all of that, I think you have to think about that. Is that the golden goose? You look at the demand that will and just the volume in the future, whether it's ride sharing or vehicle sharing, vehicle ownership sharing, or it's full personal car ownership. I think we have to think about that as a long-term play. Again, we are Hyundai is the majority shareholder at this point. We are their bespoke player in Robotaxi. It is our everyday real life. we'll see what happens in that real L4. And I think as it plays out, it's going to be solving probably that personal car ownership a little bit different problems than we do, right? You saw highway come out first and L2
Yeah,
and then L3 solutions. We're doing urban first. So it's probably a ways down the road before that really ramps into our space anyway. So that all that being said, right, we are really focused on Robotaxi and and we are developing technology that could be applied to that in the future. So
absolutely. And maybe let me ask you about this because you mentioned it, but it's a very specific point you
yeah,
mentioned. Yes, you're right. And I've never thought about this, though I've seen it. L2s looks like they proved it first in highways, in all fairness. Even Tesla back, at least
yeah,
5 years ago, were focusing on trucks and then they abandoned it. Pepsi, actually, when I was there, was one of the early customers. But you're saying L4, yeah, is focusing more on the urban customer, which of course is
yeah,
a more advanced technology. And at least the debates that you've been on, why is that? Is that because you would argue that, long range LiDAR, Aurora's working on it right now, is a
sure.
little, with diesel trucks, by the way, it's harder than urban. Of course, there's some differences in technology, but what is going on in the industry there now that is as people are people just realizing that the density of the population is higher in urban areas or
Yeah, so I mean, how we see it, right? And I think how the robotaxi industry sees it is that these assets are still expensive, and therefore they need to be super high utilization assets to be able to be deployed to make the unit economics work. And where does that work? That works in ride hail in centralized urban cities, right? The shorter the ride, in fact, the more profitable that ride can be for an Uber driver. So we see that as really the kickstart to make sure our cost per mile makes sense in that kind of case. I also think, that's really where we think the business case makes sense first. And I think again, it's that we can deploy larger fleets in that sense. When you talk about a personally owned car, I think, myself, I think about it and where would I want the autonomy to be? I'd want to go from Providence, Rhode Island to Boston in the morning on the highway with, doing some work in the back seat or getting some extra rest.
and you're
Um,
able to work from a car. Do you even need to go to the office anymore?
well, yeah, that's a whole nother debate. I certainly do, but others might not.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, application based as we look at it, it kind of goes the opposite way of what we're looking at. As far as hard or easy to solve, I'd like to say that urban is harder to solve, not because the actual driving itself is necessarily, although there's just many more variables on the streets, but it's the dynamic agents
Right.
around you, right? That's really all.
And the
That's the
people.
hardest thing to do is, yeah,
Exactly, absolutely. So let me broadly, of course, continue the commercialization topic. There's obviously billions and billions of multiple, and at this point, maybe 10-figure amounts being thrown into the robotaxi industry over the last 10 years. And at some point, investors, and already, in fact, are starting to get, there's a sentiment that it needs to start paying back. But look, it's a long, arduous sales cycle, not just direct to consumer, but various different intermediaries, including cities, various stakeholders, regulators. How are you balancing that commercialization priority, and including earning public trust? I mean, this is an industry that is definitely nascent. How are you balancing those priorities, of course, in your role with commercialization becoming a bigger priority?
yeah. I've been through a lot of hype cycles.
All
And
technology.
so, yeah, I mean, since 2009, there's been a hype cycle. Let's call it like it is. Those are hype cycles. I think, again, I'll go back to what Waymo is kind of doing today and really setting that precedent that this can be done in the near term and be scalable. I still think there's a 4 to 5 year period before it really scales, right? So while they'll get to thousands and 10,000 cars probably in that time, that's still not scale when you look at a global fleet and what Uber drives every day, or even the smallest ride hail providers. So I think there's still a big uphill battle to go into the real scale. So again, getting an investor to sign on to that is tough. You're right, and it costs a lot to do that. And I think hitting the market at the right time with the right level of investment is what you're needing to go right to go pitch right now. And I think there's a couple players that are spending a lot of money because they think it's in the next few years. And we'll see. I think it's going to take 4 to 5 years still to really hit that break even, sort of starting to take money in from scale. It's a tough market. I think that's why, the deep pocket players, again, it's a highly capital intensive, and I'm not just talking the vehicles, I'm talking the people as well for development. So I think the Amazons of the world, of Zoox, the Googles of the world with Waymo, they got pretty deep pockets, and we're lucky enough to have Hyundai in our,
They're also
pockets
public
as
companies,
well.
right? They're also public
They're
companies,
also
right?
exactly, yeah. I mean, they owe their shareholders their returns, that's for sure. So I think, at the end of the day, it's a tough business to sell, but if the industry is so consolidated already, there's already this scarcity of assets on the flip side, right? And we all know it's going to be a huge industry. Um,
Yeah.
when is the question? I think there's even convergence on that when now too, if you look at all these analyst reports. The
Yeah.
full size, it's all over the map kind of, but I think this 2029, 2030 period is really when you're going to see some boom.
I
Um,
think back in 2020, Avis actually, Morgan Stanley published this report about the entire
yep,
size of the industry and a bunch of trillions, and they actually said 2040.
yep,
Now we're seeing that convergence come to 2029, and maybe next
yep,
year we'll start. And of course, Waymo is now launching as the 6 cities, and maybe by 10 by early
right.
next year.
Yeah,
But Peters looks like, of course, very nascent industry, great topic to talk about, and you're, of course, at the heat of, sort of in the middle of all the fun. But wanted to thank you for your time today, and of course, we hope to have you again to talk about more deeper topics. But thank you.
absolutely. Thanks, Harry.